Hey, Fringe listeners. People Forward Network has produced thousands of episodes in our time podcasting. Exceptional conversations with outstanding leaders is our jam. Content that educates, guides, inspires, and fires you up. We hope you enjoy this episode. It's one of our favorites.
You have a job description, but every person who fills a job is unique. And if we can manage to allow every leader to do their job, but do it either in a way or with the extra skills that they have, then we're all going to be better. We use the top of license terminology in healthcare a lot, but I think that applies to leaders as well. And when you have leaders who have robust experience, why not let them bring that in and apply it and don't hold them back? Don't restrict your leaders. It comes back to that trust, that empowerment, and that encouragement of all of your employees, but it applies to your leaders as well.
Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast, where we work with willing leaders to accelerate the changes you seek. We'll learn from the experiences of different leaders facing real challenges and distill practical, purposeful steps to apply in your context. I'm Lee Scott, your curious co-pilot. Together, let's make positive changes for our companies and communities. Hello, Unleashed Leaders. I am here today with our guest, Michelle Mahaffey. She is the Executive Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer at Community Health Network based in Indianapolis, Indiana. And today we are going to get to hear from her about two things in particular. One is, how do you show up as the new leader on the block and be able to build credibility and relationships quickly and meaningfully with your peers so you can have an impact on the organization? And then second, we're going to take a closer look at what do we do both from a cultural perspective and a practical perspective to make sure that we're taking care of our employees when they're faced with extended periods of stress and challenges so that they don't get burned out. They can continue to operate, as she describes, at the top of their license. So with that, let's hear from our guest, Michelle. It is great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really honored. I currently serve as the leader of the Human Resources function for Community Health Network. I also sit on the executive committee with other senior leaders at the network. I've been in human resources for over 25 years, but joined Community Health Network just about 3 years ago, right at the beginning of COVID. And this is also my first spin in the healthcare industry.
So tell me just a little bit, you did come in at such a challenging time, and often that's the case for leaders, right? Like they're being called, to serve maybe in a new role to help an organization go through a challenging circumstances. What did you learn about how to lead and navigate when you're new to the industry, you're new to the conditions, and yet you've got this tremendous background in leadership, so you've got the relevant tools, but how did you navigate that unpredictable future?
Well, I came in feeling very similarly to everyone around me. We were all in a world of unknown. They called it the new normal, right? And there was nothing normal about it. I did feel fortunate that I did have a pretty good grasp on leadership, and I was able to, for my own indoctrination, fall back on leadership fundamentals.
Mhm.
And sometimes I think we take those fundamentals for granted, but being transparent, being genuine, really demonstrating trust in other leaders and other employees. You have to do that. You have to show that you trust them in doing their jobs.
I
Yeah.
love, Michelle, how you said demonstrating trust. So often we talk about, I want to get trust, or I want to earn trust, or I want to gain trust, but you just said demonstrate trust. That's amazing.
Absolutely. It's part of empowerment, right? You've got to show that we are a team. We cannot be a team if everybody isn't empowered to do their own. I did find that was very effective, but it was genuine, right? It was, I need you to do your job. And this wasn't just me getting to know my own human resources team. This was what I tried to encourage the other leaders around me to do. And it's today we're still working on reinforcing leadership fundamentals. So I think another one I would point out is leadership agility. Being able to adapt is hard. It's hard for everybody. But as a leader, it's of the utmost importance because when you're having the unknown thrown at you every single day, being able to adapt for yourself and then adapt for everyone that you're leading at the same time
Absolutely. It's funny. The question seems kind of silly. How do you lead in unpredictable times? And it's like, well, by definition, leadership involves things being unpredictable. And if it was completely predictable and certain and known, it wouldn't be leading. It would just be
Right.
doing, and maybe
That's right.
managing. But leadership is inherently uncertain. It's just the magnitude of it is. And I think in this case, it's almost a benefit when the magnitude's so great that there can be no illusions that you have all the answers, right? And so that means, hey, we are going to have to do this together versus me dictating or handing out on a silver platter the solution so that you can go do it. I question whether that's even leadership, right? That might be mentoring and that might be training, that might be managing, but it's not really leadership. So let's zero in a little bit because you had a really unique opportunity to come into the executive team and a role that hadn't traditionally been there. And so you're the new leader on the block. And how do you build trust and build that credibility with those peers? Because oftentimes, HR gets the rap of, hey, we're from HR, we're here to help, right? And you get
Yeah.
the door politely closed,
Right.
only call us when we need you, right? How did you be able to establish such a powerful partnership with those peers?
When I came in, the CHRO position had been filled previously, but it was not sitting on the executive committee. So that was the newness of the role. And it was critical for me to have FaceTime. And I use that term in two senses, right? Because when I came in, this is how I got to know people in a box on a screen. And that was all I really had. Now, I did have the opportunity to go tour some of our hospitals, but at that time, our ambulatory locations were not open. We had reallocated resources to the highest need areas, which was in our hospitals. So, getting to know people in general was a challenge. My first focus was on my peers and on the HR leadership team,
Mm.
and getting as much face time as I could was really important. The biggest thing for me was active listening. And I know we throw that term around, but truly hearing from my peers and my team members to understand what are they going through? What is this organization going through? And then following up on that, acting on what I heard, which
Mhm.
is, I think, really critical in building those relationships. I was honored to be put in such a senior level position. And I think anybody who's in a senior level position needs to earn it. And so being able to actively listen, hear, learn, and then to act on what you hear.
Is there an example, Michelle, of that you could share that you could call? I know this going back a couple of years in those early days,
Okay.
where you heard something and you were like, hey, that's within my sphere of influence. I can actually do something about that. Let me make that happen. And like you said, doing something about it is more powerful than even understanding it. Is there an example you could share?
There's one when I did have the opportunity to meet leaders in many of our hospitals. I heard from many of them very loud and clear that they did not feel like they had easy enough access to their human resources partners. And the reason for that was a change that had been put in place before I arrived, where the strategy around HR was driven to be more self service, and therefore the HR partners were not necessarily right up front. You
Mm.
couldn't necessarily go knock on their door and ask them the question of the moment. And we very quickly put in motion efforts to change that. And that involved several changes, which we couldn't act on overnight. But what we did do is we communicated out that this is a change we're going to do,
Yes.
and that we heard you and that we agree with you and we're going to change. And that has received some really great feedback.
Isn't it funny in the pursuit of efficiency, which I do believe leaders are responsible for, right? We want to be efficient,
Absolutely.
but then we start creating these barriers to communication, press 9, press 4, self-serve, which is, I think it's beneficial. I wouldn't say, only require on a human manual intervention to do it as instead of the option. I think that's just like, because that connection that folks are looking for and to be able to have a relationship that it's not just a transaction. We are a partner here to help you be more successful. I think in a lot of support organizations, whether it's accounting or HR or planning, to be able to build those relationships again. So you're demonstrating the trust, you're building the trust, and it's got to be through interactions. And we're all busy. I get it. But like you said, you wanted that FaceTime. So I want to go back to that for just a little bit of time. You're talking about physician leaders in the middle of the worst pandemic in 100 years, and you're trying to get FaceTime with them. How did you actually gain that FaceTime, and how did you use it wisely?
Well, first of all, I have to say I was very, very lucky. And one of the reasons I was very lucky is our culture and our values. We're very insistent on sticking to our values. And one of our values is relationships. And so I did not have that much trouble because they value
Mhm,
everything we do in order to put our patients first.
mhm.
And with over 15,000 employees at that time, we needed every single one, and every one of our leaders knew that.
Yeah.
So, fortunate for me, it wasn't that difficult. However, if I did have any troubles, it wasn't that difficult to say why, just to say why. I need to learn this so I can do this, or I need your input on this so we can do this. Well, you were talking about efficiency earlier, and everybody, especially during a national crisis like we were going through, we had no choice. We had to be as efficient as possible. So, yeah, that was usually a winning piece of encouragement.
Gotcha. Yeah. So like, hey, could I get a slice of your time to make your life easier, better, faster, help our people be better at what they're doing? It's a service oriented mindset. I'm here to serve. I want to contribute. I want to help you. But I need something from you so I can serve you. And that's a theme in healthcare. The patient is an active participant in their own health. They can't just say, hey, tell me what to do here, doc or nurse. And then same thing for taking care of those providers. They're an active participant in their well-being as well. But you mentioned the culture, and I mean, you said lucky. I think of lucky as the combination of opportunity and preparedness. So I think somebody else could be dealt those same cards and would not have played them as well as you. So I'm not going to let you get away with that. But let's talk a little about the culture, because you guys have intentionally built a great culture, and it's something that could be slipped away in a moment. So tell us a little bit about what it is, and then maybe let's expand on what you're doing to preserve and promote it so it doesn't erode even in the face of adversity.
I will continue to say I'm lucky because I walked into an organization that
I,
already had a fabulous
I'd
culture.
I'd rather be lucky than skilled. I'm not gonna lie about
I'm
that.
with you. I'm totally with you. But it's funny. So I frequently get the question, what keeps me up at night? And I continue to give the same answer, and that is our culture. And it's not because we have a bad culture, it's because we have a phenomenal culture. And leadership often looks to HR to say, how are we going to make sure we preserve that culture? And we now have over 16,000 employees, and we have over 200 sites of care. You have microcultures and you have macro cultures. I will tell you, for our culture, I think there are two really big driving forces behind that. One of them is our concept that every single employee is a caregiver. That can be misleading, but when you think about it, every single thing every person does in our organization is about putting our patients first.
Mhm.
So I will not touch a patient. You don't want me to touch a patient, but I have the patient in mind at all times. And I'm doing everything I can to make sure our workforce is the best it can be so that our patients get the absolute best care.
I think
So
that's brilliant. Yeah, I remember you sharing that earlier. And it's the notion that somehow you have to have direct access to be a contributor. And yet, so much of what we do across all of our society is indirect. Somebody does something which causes something which allows something else to happen. So I think language and terminology, saying you're a caregiver, whether you're in payroll or your facility services or your HR, it reminds me with Disney's terminology, right? Like all of their customers are guests and
mhm,
all of the employees are part of the cast.
yeah.
And like you're on stage. And so I think in your context to be able to say, hey, we're all caregivers is a reminder. Now, again, some people's like, but I'm not doing this. Is like, but you are indirectly. And I think that's probably something, even with new employees, you have to remind them and help them reroute around versus saying, well, there's the providers and then there's admin. Well, you've already created an us them environment. And that's not what you want in any organization. I mean, we have different roles, but we're all here to win this game.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that comparison to Disney, although we are definitely not a theme park, but we are definitely one team. And I do think that caregiver concept. And I would underscore the word giver, right? Because that's one thing about our culture. It's not the other tenet I'll bring up in just a second.
Yeah.
But I have found since I've been here, one thing that I find from a personality perspective that's in common with just about every single caregiver in our organization is they are natural givers. They really, really, truly are. In fact, if you come across a caregiver in our organization who seems like they're not really that much of a giver, chances are they may not be here that long. So it really is a consistent part of our culture. The other tenet that I think is key to our positive culture is that it starts at the top. But it doesn't have to just start at the top, it has to be perpetuated from the top.
Yeah.
And we have a phenomenal CEO who is so wonderful at putting people first. He puts patients first, he puts our caregivers first, but he sets that expectation for his leadership team. And then that becomes part of my responsibility in our leadership development, our leadership competency models to make sure that we are putting culture right at the forefront of everything that we do. Yeah, so I just think that that whole leadership competency is really important. I will mention an example. Our CEO, Brian Mills, every single Monday, every Monday, he goes in person to our new hire orientation to welcome however many new hires we happen to have that week. And some weeks it's over 100 people. But he goes every Monday to introduce himself, to share with them his passion for and his love for our organization. And he invites them to reach out to him. He invites them to walk up to him when they see him walking the halls. So I really think that that sets the tone right there. Your new hires are like, okay, if the CEOs like this, we like this culture. And then they see it reinforced with leaders in their hospitals or in their doctor's offices or wherever that they are.
Could you elaborate a little on that? I mean, you guys are 16,000 employees, 200 sites. Like you said, you've got the micro and the macro cultures. I love that distinction. And that's all normal and that's healthy, right? What are some of the things then that your team does through leadership development, through the partnerships that you have with those mid-level leaders? Because it can be perpetuated at the top, but it can die in the middle. And so how do you break through that and keep that alive all the way down and beyond the first day of orientation?
We have put in place a gathering, if you will, of our leaders called a leadership forum. And we gather all of our leaders every quarter, once a quarter. And when I say leaders, I'm referring to our directors and above. And we present to them and engage them in topics around leadership. They're called leadership forums because they are all about being the best leader we can be for our organization. And coming out of COVID, I think it's been really refreshing to refocus in on what our leadership competencies are and how they play out.
Could you give an example of one of those competencies just to help ground it with folks? What's a practical example of one of your competencies? Maybe one that wouldn't be as obvious for a healthcare organization.
We referred to agility a little bit earlier, and that is one of our leadership competencies. But I think another one that's really critical is effective communication.
Okay, sure.
And as a leader, sometimes I think we can get caught up in our own little world and leading that one world. And sometimes we forget we are actually the leader beyond our immediate footprint.
Yes.
And to be cognizant of that when we're communicating is really important. So in my role, when I'm facilitating a leadership forum, I might say things along the way that little reminders, you as a director, you as a vice president, when your direct reports or those team members who work for you look at you, you're their employer. You're their boss, but you're also their employer. So when they think of their employer, they think of you. So what does that mean? How does that impact how you communicate with the caregivers who work with you on a day-to-day basis? So effective communication, and you know as well as I do, and I'm sure your audience does too, how important communication is, but really reminding yourself who you are when you're speaking and when you're communicating is really important.
I think that's really a good practical distinction there is that communication, we often think like, well, it's what I say. And earlier you talked about it's also active listening. It's demonstrating that you listen through your actions, right? So it's behaviors. That's not even words. That's just doing something. And then it's also, like you just mentioned, it's who you are. I think we forget we are walking billboards and we think, well, I'm just the same Jane or John, put my pants on the same as you, and I'm really no different. I just have a role that I play here at work. And yet you are a walking billboard, and your facial expressions and your accessibility and your tone, all of those things are communicating more powerfully and more loudly than any particular words. And then the last thing I want to highlight that you mentioned that I think is really, really great is that as a leader, there's the team that you're responsible for, and then there's a team that you're a member of. Right. And so, yes, you've got your area. Maybe you're the facility manager, or maybe you're the foreperson of this thing, or maybe you're the director of this thing. So that's your reporting organization. And you're definitely setting a tone there, but you're still a member of a team that's also lateral. And I think oftentimes we have struggles because our loyalties feel split, right? Like, hey, I'm trying to do what's best for the organization and I'm trying to do what's best for my people. I can imagine the earlier example you shared about the self-service is like, well, what's more efficient for HR is to have self-service, which is true. It's not complete, but it's true. Therefore, we're going to reduce the amount of in-person accessibility. And you're like, wait a second, that might be good for the use, but it's not good for the goose. And then it goes, okay, and maybe being more accessible is harder on our folks and means that we've got to have more capacity than we other would like to and have a different kind of budget. But I think recognizing that there's a tension there between the team that we're a member of and the team that we lead. And in both cases, we're the bridge, and how we're communicating really is what's making that happen.
I would actually add one more dimension because
Lead.
you're a leader of your people. You're a leader as a member of a leadership team, but you're viewed as a leader to everyone else too.
Mhm.
So we have several nursing leadership teams across our organization, and they're visible not just to the nurses who work in their organization, they're visible to all of the nurses. So I just want to add that because that is something we try to reinforce, that in your effective communication, you are communicating to people you might feel a little bit more intimate with, but you have a bigger audience than you might think.
Yeah, there's people watching.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
like the expression more is caught than taught. So they're always seeing what you're doing and how you're doing it. And that's leaving little micro messages to be a patient-centered organization that is literally dealing with life or death situations, is literally dealing with a magnitude of challenges. You're still choosing to invest the time, your CEO with the new hires, your leadership forum with all of your directors and above, to invest in these competencies, agility, communication, relationships. It's a conscious investment because it's perishable, right? It will go down if you don't keep investing it. So, what would you say to those folks who say, like, hey, we don't have time to build relationships? We don't have time to invest in developing skills and competencies when they're not dealing with life and death. What would you say to that limiting belief?
I would ask them who they think they want to be in the future.
Mhm.
And if they can't make that investment right now, are they going to be able to achieve it? I think that is the one thing that really drives me and my peers in every kind of, whether it's an investment of time or an investment of money. And as you know, right now, healthcare is challenged on the financial front,
Mhm.
significantly challenged.
Mhm.
And we are having to decide, where do our dollars go? We are continuing to invest in our leaders because we know in order to deliver on our mission of taking care of the health of the communities that we serve, we have to continue investing in who we are as an organization from a leadership perspective.
Oh, I love that. It's like when you're asking where does your dollar or your calories or your time go, you got to ask yourself, well, where do you want to be in the future?
Yeah.
And let that determine where you're investing it versus like, well, what do I need to do today? And it kind of reminds me of the definition of insanity. It's like so many Americans are like, hey, I want to retire wealthier than I am today, 20 years from now. And it's like, okay, well, what are you doing today about that? And it's like, well, today I got bills to pay, man. I don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
But they believe that somehow by doing what they've always done, they're going to get something that's different, right? And that is the definition, of course, of insanity. So
Yes, it
um,
is.
pull that future state into the present moment and say, is doing what you're doing today going to get you where you want to be tomorrow? Well, I'd love to shift our focus a little bit here and talk a bit about this phenomenon of burnout and sustainability and resilience. And it's, I think, particularly poignant for you to be able to highlight it for a couple of reasons. One, you talk so much about being a caregiver, My mom was a nurse. I was an EMT. Almost every member of my family is in the medical profession in some way, shape, or form. And there's a lot of caregivers, but I find that sometimes those who are naturally most willing to give their care can also really be challenged at receiving care. And I think all leaders to an extent have this challenge, but particularly leaders in healthcare. So talk a little bit about what you have done to help address the burnout, which you guys had started this before you even hit the pandemic, but then it accelerated. Got this great acknowledgement in the Indiana Business Journal recently, and then I'd like to drill in on what are we doing, even though the resources made available. What are we doing to get the caregivers to receive those resources?
Thank you for asking that question. It is an ongoing effort on behalf of my team and I would say all of the leadership at Community Health Network. During COVID, we found, not surprisingly, that our demand for EAP services went up.
Mhm.
And I took that in two ways. One, I've got to act, make sure we have available services. But two, I was very grateful that our caregivers were asking, right? Because that's a huge sign, right? People knew enough to ask. Now, was everybody asking? No. But we acted, we actually expanded and augmented our EAP service. We actually added a completely separate vendor. So we would have robust offerings and more availability for our caregivers. We also had already in place a team called the RISE team. You may be familiar with this, Resilience in Stressful Events. And that team is made up of internal leaders and caregivers, but it's a 24-hour access service, if you will, for our caregivers and teams. And during COVID, you can imagine the trauma that's going on. And so that team was in place to be available on site or virtually as needed to support people in taking care of themselves through trauma.
For those not as familiar with that, Michelle, could you just elaborate for another minute or two about like who's on that team and how is it staffed? Like, are these other people who are also working and they're tapped to be paged and they get called into these conversations? Are they dedicated? Tell us a little bit about how someone might structure that. And not everybody's going to have a 16,000 employee organization that they're doing it, but I think being able to see like what's possible and then they can break down maybe what might be potentially probable for them in their organization.
Yeah, so it is staffed with our internal caregivers of a variety of expertise. So everything from physicians and nurses to people who are in our chaplaincy. They're chaplains, they're psychiatrists, psychologists. The goal with us with RISE is to have a variety of skills
Mhm.
available so that on that immediate basis, we can provide what is needed in the circumstances. And you're right, we're very fortunate. We have a large organization. So, for example, across all of our hospitals, we have multiple chaplains in multiple hospitals. Not everybody has that, but we take advantage of that luxury and put it to work so it's available for everybody.
How do you identify and support those folks on the RISE team? Is it a volunteer thing? Is it a career development opportunity? You get tapped and says, hey, we need someone like you on this team. What might be an initial step to that recruitment?
Volunteering, asking people to volunteer, making sure that they understand the time commitment. We tend to not really have a problem with people wanting to raise their hands in our organization to help. And I think that goes back to our culture. So we don't have that challenge of getting people to participate and to filling all of the slots that we need filled. But I think in getting something like this off the ground, I think it's making sure everybody understands the what and the why.
Mhm.
What is this about? Why are we doing it? And what are the benefits that you as an individual can get out of this? If
Mm.
you're providing this service, you're hopefully going to feel some real return on that investment personally.
I think that's great. I've seen programs like that in other organizations where they're highway maintenance workers, right? Or they're, law enforcement officers, or, they're working in an environmental science capacity and they're seeing, environmental devastation and whatnot. But having that peer based resource that's been pre-identified and says, hey, we're here. And you have a variety of skill sets, like you said, and a variety of different types. Like I might want to talk to somebody that's like me because I know that they'll be able to get it. Otherwise I'm just like, if just talking to just generic counselor, how could you possibly understand me? Well, of course they can't understand everything, but there's that belief that if they're not like me, they can't understand me. And so just removing that barrier to say, hey, we got people who are like you. You've got access to them. So that's beautiful. And again, we can do that on a small scale, even a company of 50 employees. could say, hey, we've got 3 folks that have volunteered to say like, hey, when somebody's really feeling a stressful situation, it doesn't have to be life or death. It could just be a traumatic customer interaction. And you're like, man, I feel like I really blew that one. And I don't want to talk to my boss about it. I need to talk to somebody else who's been in that situation, that create that peer support. So that's the support side of the equation, right? The resources are available, right? Now, how do you get these givers to take it, and take advantage of it? So I saw that you guys have a pretty good adoption. And I want to say it was about 40% utilization, which is remarkable. And again, I think that speaks to a lot of the things you've done preparatory that are paying dividends. But what is it going to take to get to 50% or even 60%? What are some ideas that you guys are working on?
Well, we have done a good job throughout the pandemic, and I would even say before the pandemic,
Mhm.
of communicating regularly with our caregivers about what's available and helping them think through identifying a potential need. Oftentimes, when any human hears a suggestion that here you might need this kind of service, we're not likely to act on it right away. But if we get educated on what's available and how to access it, then in the moment when we're finally like, you know what, I think I might be able to benefit from that and I know how to do it. So, communication. I would also add that throughout COVID and even today, our CEO does recordings, video recordings for our caregivers, and he does them every few weeks. During COVID, it was actually every week. And he would include a variety of topics in there that go back to a lot of those competencies we talked about earlier, being totally transparent, demonstrating trust and confidence in our caregivers, and then also sharing with them reminders of how to take care of themselves. And he will also share with them how he's taking care of himself. Those are some of the things we've been doing. There's a lot more too, but yeah.
Well, no, we got just a few more minutes. I'd love to hear maybe a couple other ones, but I really like the one where it's saying like, hey, I think, and this is part of a mental health challenge I think we have across this country of folks of getting over the stigma of saying like, we all have moments in our lives, some of us more than others, and some of them are longer than others, but we all have them. To need help is to be human. And I know with caregivers, especially, I mean, my mom was the most generous giving person, but it was like impossible to get her to receive anything. We had to drag her kicking and screaming to some medical appointments. But I need to be able to remind us, look, if you're not receiving care, you're not giving somebody else the opportunity to give care. And just think about how much joy that creates in you as a contributor and as a servant leader. If you're not giving others the opportunity, you're actually denying them. And so it was a way of kind of psychologically like, okay, hey, you're actually giving them the opportunity to give to you so they can receive what you get. And it was like, well, in that case, I'll go ahead and take one for the team and talk to somebody who can help me with my challenges. It's kind of silly that you seem like you have to say that, but I think the more we can say it's normal, it's safe, and it is going to help you be able to live longer, live happier, live healthier on the inside and on the outside. I think that's an opportunity that we as leaders to do and be vulnerable enough to say like, yes, and I need it too. I'm not superhuman and above. I think that's absolutely crucial.
So I'll share one more. We just launched this actually this year. It's a program, if you will, called My Care at Community. And I describe this as, so if you work for a car dealership, you might expect that you get the best deals on
Mm,
cars,
mhm.
right? Well, when you work for a healthcare organization, we may not be able to reduce prices, but what we can do is make sure you have the best access to care possible. And so we actually developed our own concierge line
Okay.
for our caregivers and their family members to have direct access to finding the care they need when they need it. Now, of course, we strive to make sure that our patients have the best care that they need when they need it as well. But
Mhm.
to extend a dedicated line for our caregivers,
Yeah.
it's conveying that sense of you are special
Yeah.
to us. And we were doing everything we can to make sure that you can get what you need when you need it. So, again, we just launched that earlier this year. And so far, it's going really, really well.
Well, it's a good reminder that oftentimes our employees are also our customers.
Yes.
Right. I worked in restaurants and I eat at restaurants. And, I worked as an EMT and I've been serviced by EMTs. So we have to remind Ed that, we are customers as well. And that is a big challenge in healthcare. I get the need to balance it, but to say like, hey, if we're not finding a way to make access possible internally, how are we ever going to learn how to do it more broadly externally? Beautiful. Well, Michelle, I really appreciate you sharing some of what it takes to be the new leader on the block and a little bit about the culture and practical ways that people could help extend some of those techniques in their organizations. Michelle, any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners or anything exciting you have coming up in the near term that is keeping you an agile and effective communicating leader that you do to keep investing in yourself?
What I have coming up for me is continuing to build my own leadership at Community Health Network. Again, coming in during COVID, I personally was very restricted in my ability to get to know people face to face. And I'm still pursuing that right now. I have some opportunities, but I am working on being out there with our caregivers on the front lines, or maybe it's an IT department, or maybe it's the finance department, finding ways to really build those relationships with everybody in the organization so that I can continue to learn and be the best leader I can be.
Thank you for joining us today on the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss a moment that could be the key to your next breakthrough. Let's stay connected and contribute together by grabbing that @Unleashing Leaders handle on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite network. This is Lee Scott. Keep learning, loving, and leading. Our future and our communities are counting on us.